Next up, we have what I think is going to be a really engaging session. It's going to be led by our head of marketing, Ben Hodge, who's going to be joined by a variety of industry leaders when it comes to the topic of cyber resilience. And in this panel, Ben's going to be getting their thoughts on what the cyber resiliency looks like for you and the market going forwards.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining this session. So I'm joined on stage by a panel of experts from IBM and Predatar. So the theme of this session is ultimate backup resiliency. So the guys here are going to talk on that topic with me, so I'll do really quick introductions. So first of all, we're joined by Sam Hector. So Sam joined IBM in 2011 and today holds a role on the global security team as a senior security strategist. Next to Sam, we've also got Ian Shave. Hi Ian. So Ian has been at IBM for more than 20 years on the storage side of the business. So today, Ian heads up distributed storage sales globally. And then finally, we've got Alistair Mackenzie from Predatar. So I actually learnt this morning that Alistair started working at IBM on the very same day that Ian did, over 20 years ago. Obviously, Alistair's career and journey is taken to a different point, whereby today he is founder and CEO of Predatar. So welcome, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd just say I managed to find a way to escape, Ian.
I just had much more stamina, so.
Great. Okay. So without further ado, we'll kind of dive straight in. So, the idea of this session is to really talk about this concept of ultimate cyber resilient backup and recovery, and it's something we talk about at Predatar. But let's open this question: the idea of ultimate cyber resiliency when it comes to backup and recovery. Can you actually achieve such a thing? Maybe open with you, Alistair.
Yeah, interesting question, Ben. I think you should certainly aim to achieve it, but it is an aspirational goal. I think there's sometimes a tendency to solve a problem like this with technology. So even if you were to get there, like any successful achievement, staying there and staying ultimately cyber resilient is another thing altogether. And because there's the law of entropy that says things are going to degrade over time, and it's not just that. You've got different changing, evolving landscape and different threat vectors coming in all the time as well. So you cannot just build a solution and expect that to make you ultimately cyber resilient forever.
I agree, and I think from a purely kind of thought exercise point of view, you could imagine an ultimately safe or cyber resilient backup, which is just not storing the data digitally, right? But as soon as you kind of get down that route, your data accessibility temperature just goes and approaches absolute zero, and the practicality of it is not there, right?
Not to mention your data protection's not too clever either, I would imagine, at that point.
Exactly. So you've eliminated a cyber risk, but you've created a fire risk and a physical risk and the rest of them, right? So, but that kind of leads to the crux of the point. When you're designing any cyber resilient system, there is always going to be an aspect of minimizing but acknowledging risk, right? So, you can get towards a cyber resilient system, but it's never going to be perfect, and it's going to take constant iteration. And there's two reasons for that in the security space. One is that the threat landscape is constantly changing. What you called entropy, we would probably call zero-day attacks, and vulnerabilities coming out all the time. And the second thing is, if you look at the kind of top route into companies that we observed last year for attackers, it was phishing. And that human factor is never going away. So regardless of how much you do from a technology standpoint, you always need to enable your staff and do awareness training and that kind of thing to make sure you reduce the human risk as much as possible as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, I guess you've both been sort of trying to allude to it as well. It's not just a simple, off the shelf. I think people are often looking for, look, can I just go buy a single, software package, single part number? I think you use the word solution, but it is about how do we actually build something, work with them on an ongoing basis to ensure they have the right practices to be as cyber resilient as possible. I think what people are often mistakenly looking for is where is that single answer that's going to work for everything, And like we joked about data protection, with data protection, there wasn't one answer. I don't know of any organisations that have just one answer for absolutely everything they've got. That you've got to adapt it based on what the requirements are and what the business actually needs.
Okay. Yeah, thanks guys, interesting. So I guess what we're saying is that, the idea of ultimate cyber resiliency can't be bought, certainly not off the shelf, and it's not a fixed idea or a fixed point. It's always going to be moving. But I guess could I ask the question, if we see it as being something that organisations can aim for, aspire to, where do you think most organisations, and let's focus on enterprise organisations, where do you think they are on that journey today? And maybe we'll start with Ian for this one.
Most an awful long way from where they need to be, I think, is the honest answer. We've seen with an awful lot of organisations that we've sort of spoken to that I think there's an awful lot of sort of misunderstanding around it, for example. So an awful lot of quite heavily invested in cybersecurity software of some form or fashion. I think I'm pretty safe in saying pretty much everybody's got data protection sewn up. I can't think there's going to be anybody left that doesn't have it in some form. But what we've seen many times is that very often they think those two things equal cyber resiliency. I'm stopping them getting in, I've got data protection practices, and I've got backup, so I'm good, and not realizing that actually things like backups are the primary attack vector. So the cyber attackers, ransomware attackers particularly, they've realized if you allow someone an ability to recover, they'll do it, so they're attacking it first.
Exactly. And actually I think the leading indicator of how well companies are doing in this space, as you say, is ransomware. Yeah. Because IBM do a report every year called the Threat Intelligence Index, and in 2021, 21% of all attacks we observed were ransomware attacks. And these gangs have typically a shelf life of 17 months before law enforcement eventually shuts them down or forces them to kind of relaunch themselves. But ransomware, is not going away fundamentally as a problem. And where I think firms are doing it well, or the ones that are further down the line, are still operating that in a very siloed approach. You've got the IT and disaster recovery guys doing the storage and the backup, and you've got the security team operating, quite often separately to those guys. And what's exciting about what we're doing as IBM and Predatar is that both of us are bringing together those two teams from a collaboration point of view with what we're doing with helping our clients understand where they are on that journey, but also from a technical integration point of view to make sure that there's a really rapid time to respond in the event of an attack.
Yeah, I mean, going back to your original question, where are customers in their journey towards cyber resilience? I think for many of our audience who are storage and backup professionals, they would have seen over the last 10 years, 10 or 15 years, there's been this trend towards trying to simplify backup operations, try to reduce the amount of administrative overhead that is needed to keep an efficient and efficacy backup operation. And perversely, while that was fine for the traditional threat of disaster recovery, responding to power outages or fire or floods, perfectly fine. It's actually, perversely, the completely wrong thing to do when it comes to building backup that is able to respond to cyber threats. So for example, take tape. Tape administratively is an absolute nightmare. It takes an awful lot of head count to move tapes around, keep them stored, catalogued, indexed, recover them, retrieve them. And most of the support calls that we used to get were around, I've got problems with my tape management. So what did people do over the last 10 years? Get rid of tape, make it simple, easy to administer. Well, actually, that was actually pretty good at building an air gap and giving you some cyber resilience. So what's happening now is this need to look again at how people have designed backups, realize that what was done over the last 10 years probably wasn't, in all cases, the right thing to do, given the current threat landscape. And they're reevaluating things again.
Yeah, and I think particularly because like your example of, if you went for physical, as you say, removing the tape cartridge from the library and putting it in a vault, you can't access it. Yeah. So it's pretty good. But equally, probably not going to have to worry about mice and things with the with it. So, and maybe fire. So.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, guys. So, so if we acknowledge then that a lot of organisations still have a long way to go in their journey, and Sam and Al, you've both touched upon some of the barriers, so silos between different teams internally, maybe some of the technology choices that organisations have made over the last 5-10 years in the context of cyber maybe weren't the best. I'm just wondering, are there any other barriers that we think might be getting in the way of organisations achieving this sort of best practice resiliency?
I think from a security point of view, to start with, skills shortages have been pervasive over the last decade of this industry, and just acquiring the right skills and the right people to come and drive these systems is really, really difficult. And I think that's driving a huge amount of the kind of outsourcing trend towards MSSPs to outsource certain cybersecurity functions. And I'm sure you're seeing the same thing, Al, on the storage and backup.
Yeah, give the problem to somebody else.
Because they didn't get rid of it, just gave it to someone else.
Yeah, quite.
Yeah, and I think, fun enough, we've been seeing along the skill shortage sort of side of things, I think there is this concern, and maybe it's people trying to bury their head in the sand a little bit to a certain extent. Well, maybe the problem, either pass the problem to someone else or pretend it's not there. But those we have been engaging with have realised that actually we can build an awful lot of automation around these things that actually can make it not complex for people. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that's important for people to understand. So like the backup administrator, it doesn't have to be actually you need to learn whole new skills, or that an organisation needs to hire lots of new people potentially. We can do an awful lot of automation. In fact, I would say with some of the smaller organisations that we've been working with, more so than the big, because we all know the very, very large corporates do have quite a few staff left. It's the smaller ones that go, we haven't got the skills. They need it automated end to end to make it easy for them, because otherwise they will have to just hand the problem to somebody else. So.
Yes, so going back to what barriers do I see, it's interesting to get the perspective of Sam from the security side of things. I've spent my last 20 years outside of IBM in the backup and recovery space. So I tend to see things through a very specific lens of backup and recovery. And for most of that time, organizations typically have seen backup and recovery as that insurance policy, that last line of defense. It's there if I need it, if I need to respond. And I would say, on the average, the analysis I've looked at is around $9 in every 10 from a security perspective is spent on that border security, building those fortifications. And the last dollar is spent on backup and storage. And that is suboptimal. To give an analogy, there was a French Minister of War back in the 20s, André Maginot. And he was from Lorraine in France, a region of France that was devastated in the First World War, very strong in coal and steel. And so his mindset was, I need to build a perimeter, a border fortification, which cost, in today's money, something like $9 billion. Stretched for 280 miles, in places was 16 miles wide. It was impregnable, and it did its job. It forced the Wehrmacht to go circumnavigate round the outside. And that's what it was sort of supposed to do. But because they put so much store in that impregnability, that first line of defense, the security guys, they didn't invest in modernizing the French army. So it was unable. So when it was breached by circumnavigation, going around through the Ardennes forest, the French army wasn't ready, it wasn't practiced, it wasn't modernized to respond. And so that mindset, that thinking that that's where I need to spend the money, that's where I need to invest, I think that's a barrier.
Yeah,
that's a mental barrier.
I agree, and I think what we are seeing is those that have been attacked, and unfortunately we're all hearing, daily pretty much these days about somebody new that's been attacked, and high profile. We're not small organizations getting attacked. I think absolutely on that point that they have been investing. They think that they've been preventing people getting in, but but what happens if? What happens when? I should actually now say, not if, it's inevitable. When they get through, when they break through those defenses, how long is it going to take to get back? And if the answer is weeks and months, which is probably the case if you've literally got to go and reanalyze everything, the reality is then everyone's going to pay. And that's unfortunately what's been happening. We've seen an awful lot of organisations going, I'll just pay. But I think, we're seeing that it's not just a single attack, and so that it's not going to be one payment.
Right, exactly. So yes, there are organisations that will either put budget aside in their bottom line to say, look, this is inevitable and we need to set money aside for it, or they will pay for cyber insurance and a law firm will just pay the attackers on their behalf, right?
Although they're now caveating them more and more, those insurance policies, they're putting more exclusion clauses in because they've been paying out too much. So
exactly.
They're trying to avoid it now.
And the bar to get a policy is going up and up and up, right? Yeah. So, but then what we're seeing is, not only are ransomware attacks now single extortion, we're getting double and even triple extortion, where, a single extortion is, we've encrypted your data, pay us and we'll give you the key to de-encrypt it. Double extortion is, we encrypted your data, we also stole a copy of it and we're about to sell it to the highest bidder unless you pay us a second ransom. And then even triple extortion, if they've got customer data that's been stolen or supplier data that's been stolen, the attackers will then go and approach the customers or suppliers of that organisation to say, pay us.
And this is all from the same
attack.
From the same attack. Wow.
And so just to finish on this, your point, Al, around building the walls as high as possible, that's all very well and good, but in the concept of zero trust in security, and one of the foremost strategies in security that we're helping clients adopt at the moment, there's this ethos of assume breach. So you've got to assume that the attackers are already in your systems, and you've got to behave as if you've already been breached. Because as high as you build the walls, there's always going to be a new vulnerability or a new piece of technology or a new way to circumnavigate it.
But is there a way, given that threat landscape is changing and we often design our defences based on yesterday's technology and yesterday's threats, is there any way of role-playing, and trying to second-guess what's coming? And I mean, isn't that where some of the mindset needs to shift from, rather than just saying what technology have we got today, what can we envisage might happening through role-play, and how do we is there anything that IBM has?
Yeah, exactly. Well, just like your French army example, they were unprepared because they assumed, the walls were going to protect them. But then actually, if they drilled it, they would have seen the Ardennes forest was a massive opening for them. So just like that analogy, we've recently acquired a company called Randori, which is a
great name, by the way.
Yeah, if you're into martial arts, you'll know that that's sparring effectively with an attacker, and it effectively scans a company's environment from the outside in and gives you an attacker's perspective on your environment. So what is the most tempting system? What is the most vulnerable system that they need to prioritise securing first? And then you can go on to do that on an iterative basis and continuously improve your defences.
And practice?
Yeah.
That's one thing that we're always evangelising, admonishing our customers and clients is, how often are you practicing the efficacy of your backups? How often are you validating your backups? Sorry, I say everything from the lens of backup and recovery, having spent the last 20 years doing it. So,
at least you're an expert then.
Hopefully, getting there. So, all this money and time is spent, are the backups working? How much time is devoted to practicing the recovery and the response?
And it is like the whole, it is like the whole industry going full circle, isn't it? Because as you said, I can remember back when everyone used to say backups were so important, and then what they realised was recovery of backups was so important. So then you had to test the processes, and here we are again with kind of in the cyber, environments where it's the same principle of people going, we've spoken to customers that go, well, we know we've got a vault, we know we've put data in it, but we don't know how we get it back out. And you go, well, that's not very helpful either, is it? So, cyber resiliency has got to be about recovery, not just knowing it exists.
I think putting a security lens on that for a second, because I think in storage that's really well understood these days, right? Backup's no good unless you've actually validated it, right? But in security, the equivalent is, have you actually penetration tested your systems? Do you know that, because in the example of ransomware these days, to your point, attackers will try and disable or otherwise just attack the backup system to make it inoperable as the first point of action, because then, as soon as they enforce the ransom, the company finds it very difficult to recover and it's much more likely to get paid, right?
Absolutely.
So how are businesses not only validating the backups are viable, but also validating that the systems are stable and not vulnerable to attack on that assumed breach point,
Well, yeah, and I think, because obviously you were talking earlier about the kind of the repetitiveness, of initially pay a ransom, get your data unlocked, and obviously then the follow-ons from that. But even when you've paid to have your data unencrypted, there's no guarantee that they didn't still leave malware in there. And in fact, the data suggests they clearly don't, because we're seeing multiple attacks. So once a customer's been attacked, I forget the exact percentage, but an awful lot are being attacked 2, 3, 4 times in the space of a year. And for those customers that were budgeting to pay ransom, I'll guarantee they've not been budgeting for paying it 4 times in a year. So
yeah. Okay, gents. So I think we've painted a somewhat scary picture, but we've also begun to touch upon some of the things that customers, organisations can do, whether that be through drills, data validation, etc. We're coming to the end of the time for the session, so maybe we can just end with: does anyone have any thoughts on very practical actions or steps that organisations can take to help them move towards that goal of best practice or ultimate cyber resiliency?
I mean, to take your point about pen testing, is there an equivalent for backup? Ultimately, I guess that's a backup recovery or a DR test. But we've already talked about the fact there's a skill shortage, there's a time scarcity that means it just doesn't get done. So I think the first thing that we would recommend in terms of what steps would I take is try and understand your position now. Can you benchmark where you are against a gold standard or the ultimate cyber resilient solution, that visionary pinnacle where we want to get to? We can help there. We've got technology now that enables us to extract data against what we call the 5 fundamentals. Things like, am I doing immutable storage? Have I got encryption turned on? Am I keeping a logical or a physical air gap? Do I keep 3 copies of the data? And am I regularly testing my recoveries? We can use that as a framework, those 5 fundamentals, to benchmark you against your peers and against the industry. So at least then you know where you're at, and you can't really decide how you're going to get to some place until you know where you're at, of course. So that's what I would recommend, is use some tooling that we've got. We've got a product called Predatar Insights. It's free of charge to use. It's very quick to install, and it will give you that reporting, that insight very quickly to get you that sense of where am I now.
yeah, and I think it's worth us highlighting that, of course, this is a great addition to the IBM sort of cyber resilience portfolio. Obviously, we have other capabilities as well. So we're not saying we've got a square peg and everything looks like a square hole, which I think is important. So I think it's also worth, importantly for our customers, we've found so often that actually communication within the organisation often is the issue. The security teams not talking to the IT teams and vice versa. So I'd encourage them to look at this as an opportunity, use one of these assessments, use the tools. But when we actually then go through those data points, use that as the opportunity to actually start networking internally in their own organisation, because it's when these things come together, that's when they're going to become cyber resilient, not if they stay in their silos.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think, for just finishing on a security point of view on that, we mentioned a lot about teams not collaborating. So there also needs to be a collaboration between the IT team and the security team is something that's often brought out when we do these kind of reviews and say, what's your current state, what does your future state look like, is when everyone gets in the room. So come and speak to Predatar about that, right? But the other thing is, how do we not only collaborate between teams, but integrate between technologies? And that's really where IBM Security and Storage are innovating, especially if you've got snapshots based on primary storage, and a security tool detects something really bad's happened. How do you immediately protect that backup system, make sure there's a snapshot ready to go, et cetera, et cetera? And
from a security perspective, is there any reason why storage and infrastructure SMEs, like most of our audience here, is there any reason why they shouldn't be knocking on the door of a CISO saying, lobbying for more airtime? I mean, do you see the door getting closed in their face, or do you think there'll be an open door?
Well, I don't know. I think it would. I think it would vary by organisation, but I think it's guys like you that can pull those conversations together and be the instigator of that happening, and the practitioners obviously watching today. So the 2 final things from me on a security point of view. I've already mentioned zero trust. So adopting zero trust principles like assuming breach and implementing network protocols like micro-segmentation makes it really significantly more difficult for attackers to breach and then move laterally into new systems once they have breached. And often the lowest hanging fruit for organizations in order to get a really quick level of increased security posture for not a huge amount of investment is endpoint detection and response, EDR technology, because these attacks happen on laptops, the encryption happens on servers and backup servers. And if you have agents running on those laptops and servers that look for those behaviors, not necessarily, signature-based detection of malware, but actually, hold on a second, there's lots of data that's suddenly getting encrypted. How do we detect that and stop that process from doing it? Actively blocking it at source is something that's really effective and really easy with a tool like React.
Wherever that source may be.
Exactly. So, 3 things from me.
Right, super. And we've got to leave it there, I'm afraid, gents. But thank you, that was a really good session. I enjoyed that, very insightful. So thank you very much to our panellists. Right, over to you, Rick.
Thank you.